again? No.
Good evening, everyone. This is Dean Beth speaking, and welcome to our Anglican Diocese of Ottawa 125th anniversary, the third lecture in the series that we're here tonight. Although this is a little more interesting tonight. It's not just a lecture. It's a discussion, a panel discussion between some of our experts who are going to discuss signs of hope in the face of the climate crisis. So tonight, how things will happen is Bishop Shane is going to introduce each one of our panelists and then ask them in turn where they see the signs of hope. And they will speak for about 10 minutes each. And then there will be a moderated discussion, and you can ask, well, I might ask each other questions, and you're also welcome to ask as many questions as you wish. If you would like to type those into the chat, then to Bishop Shane or to Heidi Fawcett, either way, they will get them. So the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa was founded on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and we recognize tonight the continual presence of the Algonquins on this territory, and also the people of other First Nations, the Inuit and Métis, who live here. May we always dwell on this land with respect and peace. And with that, and the important topic of climate change, I'm going to turn it over to Bishop Shane.
Thank you, Dean Beth, and welcome everyone to this evening's panel discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Linda Collins. Linda is a full professor in the Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability at the University of Ottawa. She is an expert in environmental human rights at the domestic and international levels, including constitutional environmental rights, Indigenous environmental rights, rights of nature, and environmental rights in private law. She has advised multiple national and international organizations and is the author of the Ecological Constitution. Jacob Crane. Jacob is a citizen of the Tsuut'ina Nation, an entrepreneur and community leader, and the Just Transition Lead for Indigenous Climate Action. Prior to this appointment, he served as Indigenous Entrepreneurship Resources Manager for St. Paul's University College at the University of Waterloo. He also co-founded and runs a media production company called The Arrow's Journey, which showcases the stories of small and successful Indigenous youth-led organizations. Stuart Elgee. Stuart is a professor of law and economics at the University of Ottawa and director of the university's interdisciplinary Environment Institute. He's the founder and chair of Smart Prosperity, a major green economy think tank and policy research network. His research involves many aspects of environmental and economic sustainability, with a focus on market-based approaches. He is the founder of EcoJustice, Canada's largest nonprofit environmental law organization. Robert Gifford. Robert is professor of psychology and environmental studies at the University of Victoria. His research interests include environmental, social, and personality psychology, and how these areas combine to inform studies of resource management, social judgment and cognition, nonverbal behavior, and the perception of architecture. His research seeks to simultaneously advance theory, improve built and natural environments, and address the barriers to sustainable behavior and the dragons of inaction. So welcome, panelists, to this evening. And Linda, we'll begin with you. What signs of hope do you see in the fight against climate change?
Thank you, Bishop Shane. What a great question. I love that you've posed this question and given us the opportunity to look for the positive in this movement. First of all, I'll say, like Bishop Shane and Dean Beth, I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And so I'll just begin by expressing my gratitude and respect to the Algonquin people as guardians and stewards of this territory in the past, present, and future. So what gives me hope in my little corner of the world, which is law, is the fact that judges all around the world are waking up and taking action on climate change. And we can find this in virtually every corner of the globe. So let's take a little tour of some of the most promising climate judgments that we've seen so far. Back in 2015, the High Court of Pakistan found that that nation's failure to adhere to its own climate change plan violated its citizens' constitutional rights to life and to dignity. And in an eloquent judgment, the court stated, climate change is a defining challenge of our time and has led to dramatic alterations in our planet's climate system. On a legal and constitutional level, this is a clarion call for the protection of fundamental rights of the citizens of Pakistan, in particular, the vulnerable and weak segments of society who are unable to approach this court. The Supreme Court ordered every ministry and department of the government to appoint climate change champions. It then created a climate change commission and supervised its activities in a series of 25 further hearings before it was disbanded in 2018, having achieved the majority of the goals that the court had set for it. If we move from Asia to Latin America, in the 2018 decision in the Amazonia case, the Supreme Court of Colombia broke new ground, making legal history, first of all, by recognizing the Amazon as a legal person, and secondly, by holding that the government had a constitutional duty to preserve the Amazon, in part because of its central importance in regulating the climate. It noted that the government's failure to prevent deforestation was violating the rights of future generations. And again, it ordered the government, including a number of specific ministries and departments, to produce short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals and targets. And it ordered the president and a number of ministries to immediately begin implementing a plan with an aim of reaching zero deforestation in the Amazon. Moving from Latin America to Europe, in the famous Urgenda case in the Netherlands, 3 levels of court held that the Dutch government's inadequate action on climate change violated that country's constitution. And in 2019, the Supreme Court upheld lower court decisions requiring the government to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 25% relative to 1990 levels by 2020. The court held dangerous climate change entails the risk that the lives and welfare of Dutch residents could be seriously jeopardized. The mere existence of a sufficiently genuine possibility that this risk could materialize means that suitable measures must be taken. Then a couple of years later in the Netherlands, that country again made legal history when a court ordered a private company, Shell Oil, to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Not only the Dutch headquarters central company, but through all of its subsidiaries by 40% relative to 2019 levels by 2030. And these judgments and the growing wave of climate litigation has definitely influenced and affected Canada. And we've had several breakthroughs of our own. In 2020, in the case of Mathur versus Ontario, an Ontario court refused to dismiss a constitutional claim brought by youth, arguing that the government's rollback of its climate target violated their rights to life, liberty, security of the person, and to equality. As in the Urgenda case, the court rejected the argument that a government's climate policy is immune from constitutional review. And this is the first time that a Canadian court has clearly held that a government's climate policy could violate the Charter. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada also issued a very progressive decision on the federal carbon pricing legislation. My colleague and co-panelist was counsel in that case. And the court held, among other things, climate change is real. It is caused by greenhouse gas emissions resulting from human activities, and it poses a grave threat to humanity's future. The only way to address the threat of climate change is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the court upheld the constitutionality of the act and recognized its necessity in the fight against climate change. Just a little while before that, there had been a groundbreaking case in France where the court held that the government's acts and omissions in relation to climate change had caused préjudice écologique, ecological harm, in violation of that nation's constitution. And then finally, in the spring of 2021, an Australian court held that when a minister was assessing whether or not to give an approval for a coal-fired power plant, it had a legal duty of care to prevent personal injury to children and future generations resulting from climate change. So we are seeing, in my own view, an unprecedented judicial awakening. And why should we get excited about that? Why am I excited about that? Well, we could say one reason is I'm a lawyer and I'm excited about what judges think. But the second reason why I think everybody should be optimistic about this is that judges really have a unique level of power in society. And I'll just give you one quick example to kind of put this into perspective. Those of you who rent an apartment or own a home probably feel quite secure that you're not going to have people just coming in and out and intruding on your space and deciding, to live in your living room. And the reason for that is because for centuries, judges have prioritized the rights of private property. And that's a different conversation, whether that's a good thing, but they have. And anytime judges place a priority on something, you see it take hold in society. Many of the advances that we've made on human rights have been a result of constitutional litigation. I have a little boy who has multiple complex disabilities, and he gets to go to school in a fully state-funded day school and gets to go, to and from in a wonderful school bus with a wonderful driver. And a lot of that is the result of human rights litigation, specifically on the issue of disabled kids and their right to education. So it's actually quite crucial in any social movement to get through to judges. And I would say when I began my career as an intern under Professor LG, some 25 years ago, we really weren't seeing that level of environmental awareness, particularly on the issue of climate change. In fact, I vividly remember discussing this with Stuart in the boardroom at lunch and thinking, I don't know if climate change is real, but we should still fight it because everything we do against climate change will improve air quality for human health. So even as an environmental advocate, I wasn't completely convinced at that time. I just hadn't done my reading. So to see now that judges, in so many different corners of the globe are now really taking this on, to me points to a pivot point in human history that now I really feel like we have a fighting chance because these key players are now on the field instead of on the stands. So those are my 2 cents worth about signs of hope from my own field. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Linda. Jacob, what signs of hope do you see in the fight against climate change?
This was a hard topic to address coming from an Indigenous perspective. I'm going to be quite honest. I think we've been banging at the doors for a couple hundred years, and finally people are starting to listen. 2022, 2021. I just got back from COP26. Lip service from the Prime Minister and whatever. I get that. But what I do like is that on a more local level, there has been signs of hope through conversation, like tonight. I think that's really, really powerful to come into a space like this. I was a little hesitant just because I'm not religious. I'm very traditional. I am very deeply grounded in my traditional ways of life as an Indigenous person. And I'm coming at you from Treaty 7 territory, located on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, the Nakota Sioux, and the Tsuut'ina. And that's where I'm coming at you from. So it's nice to be able to speak freely in this space, and be allowed to share knowledge, transfer knowledge safely, so that it's not always from a capture extraction point of viewpoint. So I think that on a more local level, there is work happening, especially at the grassroots level, where conversations starting where we're involving Indigenous people at that decision-making table. Are we there yet? No, we're not there yet, but there's hope because now we're here. We're having a conversation, right? Just like we are right now. And so I think once we involve Indigenous people more, and not just on the local level, but on the higher level, because of the industry, the history of energy, oil and gas, that history is something that we don't really understand, and it really comes from extracting natural resources from Indigenous people's lands, without compensation or involvement or hearsay. So I think it's really important that we get to those decision-making tables and get to a point where there is an Indigenous person at those tables to have that conversation of what that hope looks like. So we have to start somewhere. And that's why we're here, right? That's why we're here tonight to talk about hope and the future of everyone here, right? And so I do see hope there, that it's starting, the door is cracking open. I wish, Canada, so-called Canada, would crack the door open a little bit faster, but, it takes time. These things take time, and intergenerational history here, and there's intergenerational problems here that are getting brought to the forefront, and we're finally having these conversations where people can talk like this freely. And so it's a very exciting time right now to be Indigenous and to be involved and included in these conversations. So that's some hope that I see. We do have a lot of work to do, especially when it comes to climate change, climate justice, and climate action, and getting people to move forward and stop evicting, Indigenous people for defending their lands, and really, supporting those grassroots organizations. And so if you're all looking for a good organization to support, Indigenous Climate Action is a great organization. Do look them up on the web. They're a great organization to do some really good work. It's an Indigenous woman-led group, and they do some really amazing policy, just transition stuff. Really a cocktail of everything. But I'm their just transition lead. So my focus is really getting our communities prepared to make that just transition from whatever energy usage that they're on, but getting more reliance on renewable energy. So a lot of the stuff that I kind of came in working on was we would fund those projects, but we've kind of moved away from that, and we're more focused on resources development. And so providing materials, education materials on how to get involved themselves and empowering those communities to take action to start that renewable energy journey. And so a lot of that's some of the things we're doing. We're working on a just transition guide, which is an Indigenous lens on what succession in this industry looks like from an Indigenous lens. And so not from a so-called Canada lens. This is from a marginalized communities that are deciding and making that journey for themselves, by themselves, with support from these other communities, and they're deciding on what that sovereignty looks, that energy sovereignty journey looks like. And so that's happening. It is a slow process because they're not getting the proper resources that they need. But I think once so-called Canada comes in a little bit more and really starts to support that, I think in this just transition field, we're starting to see Canada's moving forward. Let's go. But then everybody else is over here. So there's this gap opening up. We need to, Canada, slow down. Let's look, let's go back, and let's make sure that we're all going forward together. And so that's kind of what my experience has been, especially at COP26. That's a very interesting space. It's not for everybody. It definitely was not for me, but I think it's important that there are Indigenous representations there, banging at the door, letting people know that we need to be heard and this is what's happening. And so there's a lot of things happening right now within the Indigenous communities on getting the just transition going, renewable energy, traditional teachings and technologies on how to fight climate action. That was something that we always kind of knew was there, and we always kind of worked with the land. I mean, you're talking about a people who never had trash. They never had trash. They utilized everything within the animal. Everything had a purpose, And when we would camp in certain locations, and I share this with you just so folks can kind of get the understanding, but when we would camp in an area, once that area started to show signs of fatigue, we would actually move camp to a new place so that area could be revitalized, so that it would grow back, and we wouldn't revisit that area for another 2 or 3 seasons. And that's just kind of how we moved around, so that we would give we would give the land a chance to heal itself. And so it's just really, I think it's kind of ironic, because like for such a long time, we wouldn't want Indigenous people to be Indigenous. We would do everything we could to change them, right? But in reality, all of a sudden, we're starting to look to Indigenous people to help figure out how can we battle climate action and climate change. And so I think it's really important to involve Indigenous people in these spaces, in these conversations, because we've been living within this world, within the Turtle Island, also known as the Americas, since time immemorial, for millennia, really, for such a long time. We've worked with the land, and a lot of times people are starting to figure that out, and looking at Indigenous people like, okay, how did you do this? Well, one, we never had trash. That's a new thing. I don't know where that came from, but we know where that came from, but that's a new thing. How can we get to that? How can we get to that? Sometimes people, they say minimalism, but that, again, like, that's not exactly right. That's not where it really should be at. It should be, well, if you want to save the planet, look to Indigenous people, put them at the forefront of these movements, and let's go. Let's listen to them and see how they would do things. And so I know that's kind of a 360 turn for a lot of folks, because again, like the history, it's all understanding the history of Canada, United States, Mexico, and all these places, and understanding like what has happened there. And it's a hard conversation to have, but that's why it's such a good time to be living in 2022, as truth and reconciliation has gone a long way, and it still has a long way to go before we can really get to that place. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's really important that we're here and that we're sharing spaces. And I'm interested to hearing more of the questions that some of the other panelists might have for me. And I'm sure I have some other questions for some of the other panelists as well. But I want to say thank you to the Bishop and for all the folks on the phone for listening to the few words that I had to say about hope in the climate change field. So we're all in this together, and we're all going to get out of this together. So we need to really hear each other out and to understand where we're coming from. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Stuart, signs of hope in the fight against climate change.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks, Jacob. It's hard to follow that. You really brought it down to a human level in a wonderful way. I'm going to talk about more technology and economies. So a little different focus, but equally hopeful. So to me, I often get asked to distill down what we're trying to accomplish. And in its simplest essence, we're trying to take the energy system that unleashed the Industrial Revolution and in many ways ushered in a level of wealth and well-being for much of the world that we've never seen before. And we're trying to replace it. And we're trying to replace it in 20 or 30 years, a system that took a couple of centuries to build. That can seem like a pretty overwhelming and daunting and scary challenge to people. And I've got 2 little boys and I teach university students. And one of the things that really strikes me, because this is about hope, is how much fear they have. I never thought of climate fear as a category, but it is. And maybe we'll hear more of this from the next speaker. I have students who say they don't want to get married and have children because they're worried about the kind of world that they're going to bring them into. And nothing worries me more than that, because if you don't have hope, you don't fight for change. So I'm not going to, but you can't have hope by ignoring the scale of the problem. You have to see your way through it. So that is the scale of the problem. Let me tell you why I'm hopeful about it. And it's when we look forward 20 or 30 years, let's start by reverse engineering, because we're in the messy middle right now. In 20 or 30 years, assuming we've made the transition to a low carbon economy, it's actually not going to be that disruptive. Your life will not look that different. You will still flip the switch on the wall and electricity will come out. It will just be generated by clean sources, not by coal or gas. You will probably still get in a vehicle, or if you have a vehicle, and you'll drive. But under the hood, it'll be powered by electricity rather than gas. Now, it may be self-driving, but the car will look the same. You will still live in a home or an apartment. The difference is it'll be way better insulated, and it'll have lots of groovy little gadgets where it'll tell your dryer when to come on to minimize electricity, and your electric vehicle charging plug will be selling electricity back into the grid, but your home will be pretty similar. And people will still get up and go to work and have jobs. But instead of making fossil fuel powered products like gas powered cars, they'll be making electric vehicles. They'll be mining for the minerals that go into solar panels and electric vehicle batteries. On the surface, our lives will not be that different. Under the hood, there will have been a fundamental transformation in the energy drivers of our economy. And the good part is, giving this talk 5 or 10 years ago, this sounded like science fiction. You can look outside your window and see that change starting to happen. 5 to 10% of vehicles on the road now are electric vehicles, more if you're in Quebec or British Columbia. By 2030, you will not be able to buy a gas-powered car. It will be illegal. All the cars sold, not just in Canada, but in most of the Western world, will be electric vehicle powered by 2030. Wind and solar power. Ontario, more than 10% of our power comes from clean energy. We've gotten rid of coal power, and it's now cost competitive with wind and with coal. So these changes are all starting all around us. This isn't science fiction. So we can do this. In fact, I don't think there's much of an issue as to whether we can build a low carbon economy. Most of these technologies are there today. The challenge is to accelerate the pace of innovation and drive down the costs. And that's really, in many ways, there are many challenges. There's moral challenges and personal challenges, but in economic and technological sense, we need to take these low carbon innovations and bring them to market and bring the costs down faster. And we're starting to do that. If you look at the cost of electric vehicle batteries has gone down more than 90% in the last decade. Within a few years, people will be buying electric vehicles not as an act of goodwill, but because it makes more economic sense. They will simply be cheaper on a life cycle basis. And the same is happening for wind and solar. Jason Kenney was very unhappy because Alberta had an energy auction for bids to sell electricity, and the cheapest bidders were wind power providers. They could actually outbid the coal and gas power providers. So that's because their technology has also seen costs come down by more than 90% in a decade. Now, that has to happen on a bunch of different fronts. So I don't want to say it's going to be that easy, but we can do this. I think the challenge is change. I think change is difficult for us individually and collectively. We see that on the streets of Ottawa, but different kind of change in the last 3 weeks. But we see that around climate change. Those same truckers were driving here 2 years ago to protest carbon taxes. So that same change was equally scary. And it's true, it's scary for all of us. But how you react to that fear is really important. You can do what Donald Trump did or Jason Kenney does and say, whoa, I'm going to cling to the past. I'm going to pretend it's not happening. I'm going to bury my head in the sand. And the problem is the world's going to move to a low carbon economy, whether Canada likes it or not. We don't actually get to decide that. We are takers in that change. Our only decision is, are we going to be among the leaders in that change or the trailers? And the reason for being the leaders is not just doing the right thing. It's also in your economic self-interest. You don't want to be making horse and buggy manufacturing at the time that the internal combustion engine is invented. You don't want to be making steamships, sailing boats at the time that steamships are invented. I can tell this firsthand because my ancestors were horse and buggy manufacturers in southwestern Ontario, the Gray family. And they had quite a good living building horse and buggies. And then the internal combustion engine came along and Henry Ford came up with the Model T. And he ate their lunch. And I've still got the sign on top of my living room, the buggy manufacturing sign from their old store. But they, in that part of Ontario, didn't keep pace with the change to internal combustion engines, and they lost out economically. So it's in our interest as a country to be among the leaders in this change. But just to kind of crystallize that we can do this, and we are starting to do this, let me give you just a few Canadian examples of success stories. So one of my favorite ones is one of the big sources of, just again, to help people get their head around climate change, you can think about it in 5 slices. So transportation is about a quarter of our emissions. In Canada, oil and gas is about a quarter of our emissions. And then you've got buildings are 10%, electricity is 10%, industry is about 10%, and agriculture and forestry is almost 10%. So if that helps you to think about, those are basically the 6 slices that we have to change, and each of them has their own solution, and we're seeing progress on each of them. So let me give you some examples. In terms of industry, a great example is aluminum. Aluminum is one of the most carbon intensive energy systems in the world. To make that metal takes a ton of energy and powered by fossil fuels. Well, they've been working on a technology to make carbon-free aluminum for a few years, and it's now just been adopted, and the first plant in the world is in Eastern Quebec, the Ulysses plant, co-funded by Apple, which buys a lot of aluminum, the government of Canada and Quebec, and Rio Tinto and Alcoa. So we are now the place in the world making carbon-free aluminum. And we can do that on a bunch of industries. We've just invested billions of dollars to convert some of the car manufacturing plants in Ontario to make electric vehicles. So we're making the cars of the future. Following up on Jacob's story, they recently announced that the 6 nations in Ontario are going to be home to one of the world's largest clean energy storage systems, the Oneida project. So the First Nations are actually partnering with a company called NRStore to be a leader in energy storage, to store that wind and solar power so we can use it when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. Mining, Canadian mining companies are starting. They're a little late to the game, but there's going to be a huge demand for lithium and the metals that go in to make electric vehicle batteries, all the minerals that go in to make solar panels. Canada should be the leader in the world in making those and making them in a clean way and in a way that respects First Nations and brings Indigenous people in as partners in making those. So these are all things that can happen. And I asked, just to finish it up in terms of giving you a sign of hope, to me, as I said, the fundamental challenge is, as a nation, can we take this change that's happening all around the world, and can we do it quickly enough? And can we be leaders in this change? And if you want to just leave you with an image, we'll see if this works. Tell me if this screen share works. Can you guys see that okay? So I've oftentimes people say that, you can't change technologies all that fast. Well, so this is the Macy's Day Parade in the left, 1905. I don't know if you can see that well enough, but pretty much all horse and buggies. On the right is the Macy's Day Parade in 1913. And you say, well, spot the horse and spot the car. I circled them in red so you can see them. There's the one car in 1905, and there's the one horse in 1913. So these changes can happen remarkably quickly. As I said, you won't be able to buy a gas-powered car by 2030. And if we put our minds to it, we can do this across the economy. We just have to put our minds to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Robert, way in the West Coast. Please go ahead. Signs of hope in the fight against climate change. Mute, Robert.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me from far out here on the edge. Thank you, previous speakers, for your interesting talks. I actually made some notes while you were talking, and I'm gonna, somewhat alter my own remarks and maybe tweak you a little bit, poke you a little bit. Psychologists tend to look at the individual level of analysis, not that the legal or technological or organizational levels aren't important. But for the environmental psychologist, it all starts with the 7.7 billion people making decisions about things. And so just to sort of tweak Linda a little bit, I just read yesterday that King County in Seattle revoked its bike helmet law because, which I think everybody here would agree is a good thing, because nobody was following it. And so therefore it didn't have any social license to it. So for the environmental psychologist, the mantra is sort of, you can't sell an electric car if people don't want to buy it. You can't have a law if it doesn't have at least a certain amount of social license. And so it comes back for the environmental psychologist to each and every person making a choice about their daily lives. So that's where I see the hope, is at the individual level, when I see people making changes in their lives, overcoming some of what I've called the Dragons of Inaction, which are the, compelling reasons why we don't do things that we should do. And there are many. There's 42 Dragons of Inaction now, and I'm a kind of collector myself. So I collect these reasons, rationalizations, justifications that people have, and then we try to figure out ways to overcome them using different psychological interventions and trying to understand construct theories and et cetera, to see how we can get more individuals on board, which from our perspective will then get the innovators to have people to buy their solar panels and electric cars, and get people to change the laws in all kinds of countries as well. So we don't have the world that we live in. So for me, the hope is in each of us, like you and like me, making changes. And I think when each of us makes a change that goes in the right direction, that's the source of hope, is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, or something like that. When you hear of a student changing his or her diet to vegetarian or vegan, or somebody giving up their car, or completely not even an electric car, then you start to find hope. So when I look through the possibilities for what kinds of things we can do, one of the main Dragons of Inaction is a sense of, I can't do it. I'm only one person. And people say, well, I don't have any power. And my typical response to people is, well, I guess, does that mean you don't believe in voting either? Because one vote's not going to change anything, or 99% of the time it won't change anything. And so the person usually says, well, yeah, of course I believe in voting. Well, it's the same thing with climate change. We have to do it one person at a time around the world, and each of us doing something. So what can we do? Well, first we can diagnose ourselves. I've created a diagnostic tool so that a person can look at a kind of 2x2 matrix of the typical environmental actions that most of us would like to engage in, with all the Dragons of Inaction. And you kind of go through this tool and you find yourself there. And as we know with other social problems, like say alcohol abuse or whatever, step one is to recognize your own problems, and then to do something about them. So first we need to diagnose ourselves. And I'm not a paragon of virtue myself. I am driving it is a very old gas-powered car. So I'm not perfect either, but we all need to diagnose ourselves as a first step. And then we need to start taking some steps. And for me, step one is to do something like what we're doing here. That is to join with others. There's nothing as powerful as working with somebody else. So, and then, not everybody wants to run for office. Not everybody wants to be a city councillor or a member of parliament, but we're all a member of a household. We're all live in a neighborhood. Most of us are in some small organization. There's climate action groups everywhere. Join something, and there's nothing that creates more hope than joining up with somebody else. We're doing a study right now in my lab on something called climate cafes. A climate cafe was started in the UK a few years ago. The idea is you meet some people in your neighborhood and talk about it, and usually you get strength from talking to other people about your own problems and their problems. And again, it's this kind of person-to-person thing that's very important. Another thing we can do is, in my eco-menagerie, I talk about mules and honeybees. A mule, apart from its bad reputation as an animal, actually is the animal that carries the heavy load on treks and whatever. And so the mule for me is the person who's already doing a whole lot of everything for the environment. And I think we need to reward those people more than they do. And I'm not talking about the famous people, Greta. I'm talking about the woman down the street who's doing absolutely everything already that she can. She needs our compliments. She needs maybe even a financial reward. The other eco-menagerie that is surprising to some people is what a German colleague of mine calls the honey. Well, I call it a honeybee, but what he calls it is a lot of people are doing pro-climate things without being on board with the climate issue. So, for example, it's the person who insulates the house. It's, Jason Kenney insulating his house to save money, if I can use one example. And Florian, who did this analysis, found that something like 70% of pro-climate actions are actually done by honeybees who don't care that much about climate, but they are doing stuff. Or the person who rides his bike and you ask him, why are you riding your bike? And he says, for my health. And you say, what about the climate? I don't care about the climate. I just my health. So you add up this and it comes out to some enormous amount of pro-climate actions on the part of individuals. So my theory is don't try to change these people. Don't argue with them. Give them a discount on their bike. Give them a bigger discount on their home insulation. And that's fine. The other thing we can all do is emphasize that climate change is pretty much everywhere here. And so and especially this group, I think, could be amateur scientists. Are you a gardener? Do you look into birds, butterflies, whatever? Start recording the changes that you see and share them with other people. And you end up feeling a sense of hope in the sense of I'm accomplishing something against this feeling of each person has no great sense of control. And so we do have control over our own diet, what we learn from walking through the woods, and Indigenous people can talk about the changes they've seen through these generations, et cetera. So I see each of us as our own source of hope. That is because we can change. I can change. I have changed in some regards, but I could change more. You could probably change more. And what we have to do is to find ways to work with other people in our household, all the way up to the federal government, work with other people. And that's really the key, I think, is this sense of working together. Let's see if I had any other comments here before I stop. Organizations. The last thing I'll say is by doing so, we can be models for the other people around. I wouldn't say to argue with other people. It doesn't get anywhere with a climate denier to argue with them. But if you simply are a model, people eventually, that's how a lot of behavior changes. People look around and say, oh, wow, that's the president of the university and he's riding a bike. Wow. I guess it's cool to ride a bike now, even if I'm a fairly well-established person. So be a model, be an amateur scientist, make changes, join up with your friends. And it all starts for me from the bottom up, and then the top changes. That's when the organizations change, the innovators are encouraged, and the laws change. So thank you. That's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all. Again, if you have any questions, please write them into the chat and we'll try to reproduce them. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to the 4 of you. And as I listen and absorb what you're saying, it seems that we have, ancient Indigenous wisdom in our midst, an important voice of wisdom. We have the capacity to innovate and to create technologies which can quickly change things. We have the power to put in place legislation and a court system which can enforce things. But in the end, it comes down to human agency and human choice, very, very interesting. I'm just wondering if you have questions of one another, the 4 panelists. You're all wise in your own areas, and you may well have some questions for one another. So I'll invite the panelists to unmute yourselves and perhaps ask questions of one another for a while.
I have a question for Jacob.
Go ahead.
I was just wondering if you could give us some examples of Indigenous communities that are embarking on a renewable energy journey or that have made progress, just to kind of get some concrete, examples.
In Alberta, within my community, there is electric charging stations. And so that's one thing about the just transition that's happening within my own community. I've also seen solar panels that are powering a community center within my community. So that's one example. Another example, there is a camp in Northern Ontario. It's run by the Ottoman Collective, and it's on traditional Huron territory, I believe. And they are solarizing a land-based learning center for Indigenous youth. And the entire camp is being solarized. So that's just some examples.
Cool. That's inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah. I know there's 2,500 Indigenous renewable energy projects in so-called Canada currently. I couldn't tell you where, but it's from little projects like that. So there's 2,500. Anyways, go ahead.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think these panels are sometimes more fun when people start debating stuff. And we all seem to have an overwhelming amount of agreement. So let me stir the pot a little bit. In the last election, you heard a lot of debate about whether Canada is actually making any real climate progress right now. And so let me take a position on that and see if I can get people to engage a little bit. So the two arguments you really heard were emissions haven't gone down under your watch, Trudeau, and you bought a pipeline. So I think both of those arguments are wrong. The emissions one is wrong because, it's right in the numbers, but Canada has actually made more climate progress in the last 5 years, if you want to be optimistic, than we did in the previous 25 since we signed the climate treaty. The government has brought in the last 5 years, one of the largest carbon taxes in the world. They've phased out coal power, the largest source of carbon emissions in the world. They've brought in a low carbon fuel standard requiring all fuels to be massively decarbonized, ban the sale of electric vehicles by 2030, legislated a requirement to get to net zero by 2050 and 5-year targets each way, and spent tens of billions of dollars investing in some of the companies and technologies I said. And then people will say, and the reason you haven't seen the emissions gone down is there's a lag, right? If I bring a carbon tax in today, you don't run out tomorrow and sell your car or buy a new house. You wait, and when you're ready to buy a new car, when Robert's looking to buy a car someday in a few years, he probably will buy an electric vehicle. But he's not going to run out tomorrow because BC had a carbon tax. So when you're looking to insulate your house, there's a lag effect between the policy and the emissions. So for sure, Canada's emissions are going down. The numbers you see are 2 to 3 years behind the reality. And the pipeline one will really stir the pot. But as Linda will know, I've sued many oil pipelines in my life and sued many oil companies. So I'm not exactly on their Christmas card list. And so I won't say whether I wish we had a pipeline or not, but I will say this. I would be happy to live in a world that didn't need fossil fuels today, but we don't live in that world. People still put them in our cars. We put them in our planes. We use them to heat our homes. And that's not going to change tomorrow. So if Canada stopped producing oil and gas tomorrow, we would simply have to import it from a whole bunch of other countries. So in many ways, the pipeline debate is a bit of a red herring. What's really going to move us beyond the age of oil is to choke off demand for oil and gas, not supply. Canada is a tiny fraction of the world's supply. If you want to move to a low carbon economy, we should be boycotting fuel powered cars, not necessarily pipelines, because the age of oil will end when we stop putting it in our gas tanks and we stop using it to heat our homes. And that will be when we have alternatives that don't require us to use oil and gas. So I think we're picking the wrong fight, and we're wasting a lot of good energy in this country over something that could actually be more constructive and less divisive as a nation. So there you go. Hopefully I'll stir the pot a little bit.
I think Jacob wants to reply to that. Go ahead, Jacob.
Good.
I think that's great. That's great. I think that's really good, Stuart. I think one of the issues that we're seeing now is coming from a marginalized community is that Canada's moving forward. That's great. Awesome. Go get her, Canada. But what's happening is there's this gap that's opening up. And so Canada's going to get there. Well, I personally don't think they're going to hit that market, but that's speculation, as they would say. But but this gap is opening up. And the problem is that the speed of these communities. And so we have to start looking at how can we support this and how do we build more equity amongst these marginalized groups so that, okay, we got here, but then all of a sudden there's still poverty in 2050. So how do we look at that? So we have to really involve Indigenous people from the BIPOC community so that we can get there together, right? That's what we want, is we want better futures for everybody. So let's grab everybody and make sure that we're going forward together, right? Because we want the best outcome for everybody. And so that's one thing. I don't know where I was going with that, but I just wanted to say that. And then two, pipelines. It's such a fun topic. I personally, from a community that's very economically advanced, considering of where our location is. I'm from Chitina, and so we're like those unicorns, that we're like, oh my gosh, your community is doing so well. Yeah, I come from that community, unicorn, within Indigenous communities. Okay, so sorry, back up. Let me talk about that, but. I don't really necessarily have an issue with the pipelines. I have an issue when they're pushing pipelines down Indigenous people's throats and doing it in a way that's causing this tension. That's my issue. And that's where I kind of got involved in this space. Before, I never really had an issue, but when I see, Indigenous land defenders getting, hosed down and getting arrested and getting, beat up and, shot, rubber bullets, especially during the no DAPL. I have an issue with that. I have an ethical issue with that. So I'm going to step in and voice my concern now. And then you compare that to what's going on right now within the protests. I'm like, what is happening? What is going on? This is a perfect example of privilege and what is happening here. So I don't want to say it like that, but I have to. So my issue is not with the pipelines. My issue is when they're pushing and enforcing these pipelines through these Indigenous territories that are their land, and they're getting imprisoned for defending their land. Whereas we're shaking hands with these people for saying, thank you for standing up for all of us. So I don't know. I'm not attacking you, Stuart. You're a good guy. I'm just putting this out here so that we're stirring the pot as we're talking, having conversation.
Thanks, Jacob. Robert, I saw your hand, and Linda as well. Robert, did you want to jump in? And then Linda?
I'll just keep my comment short. I agree with Stuart in the sense of demand. I just translate that back into, the choices that each of us make. And so that's what demand is in economic terms, is a whole bunch of us either, moving in the right direction or not. And so I agree with you, Stuart, that it's a matter of demand. A pipeline becomes useless if there's no demand for the product in it. On the negative side, I think we have to think, even as Canadians, kind of globally. And, I've been tracking the sort of global emissions, and they've gone up 2 or 3% every year forever so far. And so globally, no matter what Canada's doing, we still have a ways to go. Last year they went up. The year before they went up. They're at record high levels. So, Canadians are doing a good job, I think. I don't disagree with you, Stuart, but somehow we have to get the rest of the globe on track here. That's what.
Thank you, Robert. Linda.
Yeah, I would just say in response to that, to sort of mirror back to you what you said, I think the most powerful thing anyone can do at any level is to be a model and to be a leader and to invest. But I kind of wanted to, I suppose, synthesize Stuart and Jacob's comments. Personally, I was apoplectic when I became a partial owner of a pipeline and very concerned about lock-in. But I quickly also came to the conclusion as well that there was probably, certainly from the environmental movement's perspective, better places to put our energy. And for me, I think there's a deeper level of kind of public policy driver that could be really helpful with this. And that is this whole concept of replacing the idea of economic growth as our priority with the idea of well-being. And that really encompasses a lot of what Jacob is talking about. What kind of country do you want to live in? What price do we put on equity and equality and well-being? And what's interesting is that a lot of the policies that can benefit the climate have also been shown in really robust research to improve human happiness and health. And imagine what it would be like if our governments were really primarily centered around that, you know. So many people have heard of Bhutan and the idea of gross national happiness. Many countries around the world now have, at a high level in the federal systems, you know, some kind of body that's in charge of reviewing legislation for that. And of course, you know, Robert Kennedy said it. There are many things that most of us would agree are bad improve GDP. And many things that most of us agree are good are not counted in these economic equations. So one of the things that really occurred to me as I watched what was unfolding 3 blocks from my home was how frequently protesters said when interviewed, "I'm so happy here. I've never felt this kind of sense of community. I've never felt this sense of solidarity." And, you know, my first thought was like, well, that's the problem. You know, if we were doing a better job with things like air quality, which we know has a huge impact on human health, which in turn has a huge impact on human happiness, green space, parks, setting up community infrastructure that encourages interaction and unity. Like when you actually meet people's real needs, they consume less. You know, people consume more when they don't have their deepest human needs met. So I think that's also a really interesting and exciting area. There's a great book, if anybody's interested in this, by Charles Montgomery called The Happy City. And I'll just wrap it up with this amazing quote that he says. He says, you know, urban planning can't eliminate all forms of equality, but it can provide equality of quality of life, that every child has a green space to play in, and that no matter where you live, you have opportunities to mix with your neighbors. I mean, I think that's a really optimistic and exciting vision, which would have clear implications for a stable climate.
Thank you, Linda. Jacob, did you want to add something?
No, I was going to say there's a lot of bureaucracy too that I see in these government spaces and old boy system. I used to be an ED for an air quality organization in Salt Lake City, and they have some of the worst air quality in the nation down there. And every year, you know, whenever the government dollars would come in to support air quality and initiatives to help reduce that carbon and all that fun stuff, right? All the nasty air going into the world, into the air. Only one group would get it, or 2 groups, and they wouldn't do anything. I mean, they said they would do stuff, but it would just, I mean, the air is still really bad and still considered smog lake city. So it's like breaking down that bureaucracy and understanding how to get that done too. So I don't know, putting that out.
I'm just going to address, Linda, do you want to add something quickly? There's a question from the audience. Okay.
Sorry,
So
I just didn't succeed in putting my hand up. There we go.
No worries. This kind of brings together something each of you have said. The question, the starting point for the question is something Jacob said about no trash. And the question is, you know, how do we move to no trash? Is it a matter of technology? Is it a matter of legislation? Is it a matter of human behavior, or all 3? So I'll put that out there and ask Jacob, if you want to jump in first. It was sort of your comment that spurred the question.
The thing is that I'm just going to use the United States in this context just because I'm going to use the United States. Land of the free, home of the brave. That is problematic. Land of the free, being able to do whatever the heck I want to do, buy as many things as I want to do, turn the water on whenever I want to, leave my lights on whenever I want to, because I have that right as an American. That's problematic. That's why we're here. Capitalism, consumerism, that's another reason why we're here. And to say that hurts people's ears because it makes it sound like this guy just wants to just change everything. He's dangerous. Let's put a track on him because he's speaking against our way of life. No, I'm just saying, let's just be honest. That's how we got here. That is how we got here, ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary people. That's how we got here.
Right. So
anyway.
Trash is directly related to consumerism, and some extent to the rise of the industrial system, the availability of goods, and so on. The question then is how do we address that? You know, is it through legislation? Is it through technology? Is it through a change of behavior? Is it through all 3 of them somehow working together? Stuart, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll jump. That should be your next panel on the circular economy. That's it's a concept that has some overlap with climate change, but it's actually a whole different issue. My friend John Coyne, who's the VP at Unilever, calls it an economy without a tailpipe. This will really be the next. It already is, but it will be the next big global environmental issue as people start to feel like we're getting a handle on climate change, which won't happen quickly. This sense of how do we reduce our waste and drain on the world's resources will be huge. So one of the big ones is food waste, right? About half of the food we grow ends up as waste. In a world that's a lot of hungry people in it, that's just criminal. And it's also a huge carbon footprint. You think about all the fossil fuels that go into generating that, all the impacts on soil. So how you do it is a really long conversation, but it's really, I'll let Robert and others talk about the individual choices because that's important. And we're seeing a lot of that in people's food consumption decisions. But on the tail end and the front end, I guess I'd say, sure. I mean, in many ways, we could do a lot better than capitalism. But I think if we're going to solve these problems in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to solve them in a largely capitalist system. We're not going to overthrow capitalism in the next 20 years. So let's work on focusing more on happiness and well-being. I agree. But we can do a lot to make capitalism work the way Adam Smith wanted it to work. Because Adam Smith was actually a professor of moral philosophy, as many people may not know. And so his other best-selling book was not The Wealth of Nations. It was The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he didn't actually see a conflict between markets and morality, but it only works if markets actually price things, if markets tell the truth. So if you look at the countries that have the lowest water consumption, to go to Jacob's point, they are the countries with the highest price on water. If we were doing a slideshow, I'd show you the chart. It would actually blow you away. There's an almost X relationship between the countries that have the highest water price and the countries that have the lowest water consumption. The exact same chart exists for vehicle fuel efficiency. The countries that have the highest carbon gas taxes have the highest vehicle fuel efficiency. So one of the best ways of encouraging reduction of waste is to make it expensive to be wasteful. If we charged a lot to dump things at landfill, if we charged a lot for wasteful use of water, and I say wasteful deliberately, you don't want to make basic needs expensive for people. Your basic needs for water should always be affordable. But beyond those basic needs, if we had an increasing luxury tax on your use of water, people would use a lot less water. It happens in countries around the world. We're late to the party on that. Anyway, if you're interested, just Google the term circular economy, and you'll actually see a lot of people doing a lot of thinking about this.
Thanks, Stuart. Robert, a lot of this is punching into human behavior. Why don't you jump in, and then Linda?
I'll start with the hopeful side. I'm not sure where other people live, but here, all the food waste is collected at the street from residences and gets recycled. I personally I'm able to do it, not everybody can. I put all my own food back into my own garden. And the restaurants here are starting to do things like recycle. Some of the bakers are giving away their extra bread to charity. So a lot of food waste people are working on it if you want some hopeful signs, which is a good thing. And of course, not to beat the drum too much, but these kind of wealth taxes are not going to happen unless people are on board and support them. And so that's part of our job, is to get people on board to support taxes like that. And as much as I have a kind of anti-authority hippie background, I've come to believe that we're not going to get away from capitalism. The attempts to do it have been terrible failures. So what we have to do is improve capitalism so that it goes in the right direction.
Okay. Linda.
Yeah, I would just say, and it's obvious that really it is a combination of all three. So, of course it's about individual behavior, but how many of us would pay the same amount of taxes that we do now if it was voluntary? Like, have a really honest conversation with yourself about that. Would you pay as much as you pay now if it was voluntary? Probably not in a lot of cases. Personally, I feel great when I pay my taxes because my son uses a ton of healthcare and I'm in a pretty chronic state of gratitude for what we have for him. And so I'm happy to pay my taxes, but I'm not sure I would pay that much if I was just searching my heart as to how much I should pay. So I think it's just indisputable that legislation plays a really, really important role, legislation and judge-made law. But that's absolutely right. It can't drastically outreach public willingness, public acceptance. But, law can lead. And I think we saw that in Canada, for example, in terms of same-sex spousal rights. I mean, there was early leadership at the Supreme Court of Canada before there was widespread public change in consciousness. But, you can't be as a court or as a legislature sort of 100 years out beyond everybody. So the good news about that, and what I always tell my students when they're overwhelmed, is you don't have to play every instrument in the orchestra. It means that there's a role for every person. If you're an artist, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a minister, if you're a meditator, if you're a hippie, if you're a lawyer, you have a role in climate change. This is something that really requires widespread transformation at all levels, which means everybody has a role to play.
Thank you. Thank you all for responding to that. Jacob, did you want to add something else? There's another question that I wanted to put to the panel, but go ahead, Jacob. You're good? Okay. Robert, did you want to add one more thing to that last discussion?
I'll make it really, really short. I agree with Linda. Don't play every instrument. What I tell my students is everybody is good at something different. Well, it overlaps a little bit. So do what you are good at.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is one that concerns advocacy. And the individual is wondering, how do you influence government? It feels like getting nowhere writing letters. What's the most effective way to influence policy, essentially? Is there a group? Is there a method, and so on? What's your take on that? Jacob, I'm going to start with you because I have a feeling you'd love to influence government policy.
Well, at COP26, I learned there's an inside and outside game happening where the outside influences the inside and the inside influences the outside. So I think I think the right to protest, the right to, I wouldn't even say protest, the right to advocate outside of government space goes back to the beginning of building these countries. I think you have the right to do that. So I don't really see a problem with it. If people want change, they're going to go out and they're going to holler and hoot. Look at how it's happening right now. We got people blockading, the ports of entry. Like, they're going to get their way. So I would just say follow suit. And, if you want to change and influence, those policy makers, sometimes you got to lay down and let people know that you're here and that you're not moving, and that you have to at times. If it's hurting your community at that point and you really want to change, you got to start to lobby those lawmakers. And sometimes you have to get out and put yourself in front of a moving semi truck to get them to slow down, because there's elders here that are trying to get through. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Jacob. Stuart?
In 2 minutes or less, how do you influence government? Spent my life working on this one. I guess I'd say there's influence at election time and there's influence on particular issues. And they're very different strategies, obviously. And the individual issues, there's a whole bunch of ways, but one of the ways that's surprisingly powerful is actually contacting your member of parliament. People who actually take the time to make a phone call or write a personally hand-signed letter, they assumed there's 100 other people that were thinking that and didn't. So not just an email, but taking the time to either phone or go to their office once we're past COVID, or to call, write a letter, that has real influence. And I'm going to be, probably way too partisan than I should be. And I say this as the son of 2 generations of conservative members of the legislature. The most powerful thing we can do is to continue to elect governments of any stripe who take climate change seriously. I mean, for better or worse, a lot of these are collective action problems. And the entity we have to deal with the collective side of it is government. That's why it exists. If you want to change an energy system, I can't change an energy system myself. I need a government that is the owner of that system to change it. I can't change a transportation system by myself. I can change my car, but without government taking this seriously, if we continue to elect, either a Trump in the US or Jason Kenney or a Doug Ford in Ontario, that sets climate progress back 4 years. Everything we've all done for years gets killed. So no party has a monopoly on virtue. I mean, Gordon Campbell in BC that brought in the carbon tax was really a conservative. That's who the Liberals are in BC. There have been NDP governments like Rachel Notley's that did great work, and there have been Liberal governments that did horrible stuff. So this isn't a push for any one party, but if we elect a party in Canada that doesn't believe in climate change, we are going to blow all this up and spend 5 years going backwards. And worst of all, it will scare investment capital out of this country. Nobody is going to invest in a clean energy system in Canada or an electric vehicle production plant if we're seen as a country that does what Jason Kenney did or what Doug Ford did in actually ripping down wind turbines. So you actually need stable long-term policy. This is a 20 to 30 year economic transition, and Europe has this. You look in the UK, Angela Merkel was a conservative. Boris Johnson is a right-wing populist, but he's still moving forward with UK's climate policy in a very serious way. So we've got to get over this right-left polarization in Canada, because it's only us, the US and Australia are the places that have this anymore. And we've actually got to have all parties in our system taking climate action seriously. And as voters, we've got to send a signal to parties that don't take it seriously that it's going to hurt them. That's the only way it's going to change. So that's what I think. You can have enormous power. And if we get that one thing right, we're going to do it.
Thanks, Stuart. Robert?
Oh, I didn't really have my hand up, but
Well, no, I'm just considering what each of you have to say about how we influence government.
I'm sorry, how to govern. Well, again, I'm just sort of congruent with Stuart in saying we have to elect the right kind of parties, but of course it comes back to each person having the right attitude to vote that way. So it's a matter of getting people to the polls. It's a matter of convincing more people that climate is important. A recent Angus Reid poll I just came across asked 1,800 Canadians, what of all the problems is the most important problem in Canada? And I was pleasantly surprised that climate change is the #1 issue out of 10 or 15 issues for Canadians if they're asked what is the most important problem. It's funny because it's a little bit different. You ask people to rank them, but if you say what is the #1 problem, it's climate change. So all we have to do is to get that message across to all the parties. And I have to conclude by saying that Gordon Campbell's decision to started a huge unit at the University of Victoria called Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which I helped to start on Gordon Campbell's money. So
Thanks.
I have a personal connection with that.
Thank you, Robert. Linda?
Yeah, I would just say on a very concrete level that if there's anybody that's really interested in influencing government, there's an excellent NGO in Canada called Green Pack, which endorses and channels volunteer hours and found money to environmental champions from all parties. So it's specifically and explicitly nonpartisan. They're not telling you which party to vote for, but they're telling you which candidates have an environmental track record. And it's not based on a platform. So it's not based on lip service. It's based on what have these people done with their lives to this point. It's actually a pretty inspiring organization and well worth checking out. I think we need to abandon for all time the idea of party loyalty. Parties aren't real things. Parties don't live and breathe. There's no reason to be loyal to a party. We need to look at policy and people. And we need to, I think, reject us and them thinking. We need to be willing to forgive. We need to be willing to accept differences of opinion and really be willing to work with everyone. None of us is perfect. And we're going to have deep disagreements with people. But we all agree that we want our children and grandchildren to live on a thriving, viable planet. So this should really be the unifying issue, and I mean, I guess this goes back to Robert. How do we explain that, I'm not here to take your job or criticize your way of life at all. I mean, we want the same things.
Yeah, thank you. Just one last reflection. We heard the phrase climate fear. I think, Stuart, you introduced that and how immobilizing that is. And I'm just wondering, just a couple of minutes or a minute reflecting, for you personally, what helps you to overcome climate fear? Like, what is it an intellectual argument? Is it the behavioral? Is it spiritual? Is it, how do you, because I think we all do feel climate fear from time to time. It's pretty scary. And I'm just wondering, how do you respond to climate fear as an individual? Jacob, do you want to start?
Or I think just having these conversations and making sure that we're all heard. And I think this is getting somewhere, and I think this needs to happen more. So I feel like there's hope here. There's a lot of hope here and hope for the future. So I think this would be really good to just have this like a million times across the world, and then we'll keep getting somewhere. So that's all I have to say.
We need one another to make the fear melt away a bit, eh? Yeah, Stuart.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to me, I think what makes things problematic isn't the fact that there's a big problem, but a sense of powerlessness, right? A sense that there's this big problem out there and I can't do anything about it. And climate change is a big one on that, right? Because it's a consequence of all the action of 8 billion people. So to me, it's the things I said before. It's a sense that, if you think about what a low carbon future looks like, it's actually not that scary. Yes, we may want to, it would be great if we kind of changed the way our economy worked and we had a more moral and happiness-based world, and I like that. But not everyone wants that world. So we could still live in a greedy capitalist world. But if we change the energy system for that greedy capitalist world, then that's one less problem to solve. And we can work out all the other justice and equity issues without a melting planet. And it actually is not that hard. I mean, most of the technologies to build a low carbon future exist today. Some of them still have to be scaled up and brought down in cost, but we can actually do this. We know how to do it. We just have to put our mind to it. And I think Jacob probably hit the nail on the head. I think the biggest challenge is the equity issues around it. I think it's a sense that we're not going to leave people behind, and that those who are adversely affected by those changes, like the Alberta oil workers, or if you work in a coal mining town, I mean, there are some people that are going to be left behind. As a whole, we're still going to be well off. A low carbon economy will be just as wealthy as a high carbon economy. We will still make stuff. We'll just make low carbon stuff, not high carbon stuff. So it's not going to be overall a poorer world. The big change is ensuring that those who are adversely affected by the change aren't left behind. And I think if we focus on that, then we'll solve this one.
Thank you. Robert.
What I tell people, well, I have to tell you my own personal story, which was writing an article 6 years ago now with my daughter on climate anxiety. That was my very personal hope, but that doesn't apply to everybody. It was a wonderful experience. Nothing like publishing an article with your daughter and your son. I've done both. But what I tell my students is do what you can. That sense of doing, and we have different abilities. If we don't have much money, there's something we can do. If we have a lot of money, there's stuff we can do. And so all of us can be better climate citizens. Just do it. Do what you can. You'll feel better.
Thank you, Robert. Just on that note, you had mentioned a worksheet, a self-evaluation worksheet that you had devised. Is there a link to that? Is that something people can access, or is it something that's administered?
No, it's a kind of a PDF, a form fillable PDF. I can share it by email or something, but
perfect. And yeah,
I'll do that after if you want.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Linda.
It's a great question. On a personal level, and this isn't something I would talk about much at conferences, but it is for me a matter of faith. As a person of faith, I try to trust that things are working out even if I can't see that. But I also spend a lot of time, and I encourage my students in environmental law to invest time in deliberately cultivating environmental optimism. There's an excellent book by David Boyd called The Optimistic Environmentalist. And there's a number of initiatives like that. There's a wonderful initiative called the Good Stories Movement, which is sharing video clips describing environmental success stories. And then, as you've seen me do just naturally over the course of this evening, I remind myself constantly of the life-changing breakthroughs that we've seen in other areas, all of which seemed impossible. I think to myself, 60 years ago, my son would have been institutionalized and he probably wouldn't have lived past age 10. And instead of that, he's had a wonderful life with people paid by the government who not only teach him, but love him, and we love him at home. And really lift him up. So he has grown up with this incredibly high sense of self-esteem and self-love because the world has changed, through individual choices, through social change, through litigation, through the rise of human rights. Those changes would have seemed impossible to the parent of a special needs child 100 years ago. So the impossible not only can happen, it has happened many times. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to, we have these narratives in our mind that spin, right? A negative story over and over again, but you can catch that mindfully and you can reverse that and tell yourselves the stories that actually make you stronger.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's been an absolute delight to share in this hope-filled conversation. And it strikes me through language that I would use that the Creator has already placed the solutions in our midst, or the means to develop those solutions. And if we collaborate with one another using our diverse gifts, we will be able to exercise our ingenuity and our wisdom and our love and implement those solutions. So there's every reason to be hopeful in the face of real challenges as well. So thank you so much. I'll hand things over to our Dean now to wrap up the evening. Dean Beth.
Well, thank you so much, Linda, Jacob, Stuart, and Robert, for just an inspiring conversation, educational as well. I learned more tonight in this one conversation than I have in a long time about this topic. So thank you from all of us to the four of you, that we may keep talking together and learning together and acting together so that we can stand in the face of this and overcome as we believe we can. I also want to say thank you to everyone who participated tonight and those who will watch this at another time. I hope that you have learned lots and are inspired as well. Our next and final lecture in our 125th anniversary series will be by the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells of St. Martin in the Fields of London, England, on the topic Reimagining Church. So much as a big a topic practically as climate change. We all know that, those of us who are in the church. So please stay tuned for that. Now, please mark your calendars. It's going to be on Sunday, March 13th at 3 p.m. So Sunday, March 13th at 3 p.m. And we look forward very much to enjoying Dr. Sam Wells and what he will have to challenge us with on that night, that afternoon, I guess, for us, night for him. I think, or morning. I can never remember which way it goes. But anyway, we'll be there at 3 o'clock. So thank you all very much. And I think that we are well on our way tonight with lots to hope and in tonight and to dream of the future together. So blessings and take care, everyone.